The door hit Mirelle Ashcombe in the back before she even cleared the porch steps. Not a push, a kick. Her stepmother's boot, flat against her spine, the kind of force that said, "This is final," without needing a single word. Mirelle stumbled, caught herself on the railing, and turned around. Margaret Ashcombe stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and she looked at her stepdaughter the way you look at furniture you've been meaning to throw out for years. "You're 18 now," Margaret said. "Figure it out." The door closed. The lock turned. And just like that, the only home Mirelle had ever known became a place she would never enter again. She stood there in the cold with a worn leather satchel over one shoulder and her grandfather's old field notebook pressed against her chest, and she thought, "If I cry right now, I will not stop." So she didn't cry. She walked. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, if you've ever been looked at like you're the problem just by existing, then you already understand something about Mirelle before I tell you another word. And I promise you, what she did next will stay with you. Stay with this story. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the tales we tell on this channel don't let you go easy. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your city or your country. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't go anywhere, because this is only the beginning. The town of Iron Hollow sat at the base of a long valley that the wind loved to punish, and it had the kind of residents who believed they'd already seen everything worth seeing. Ranchers, merchants, a sheriff who wore his badge like it was stitched into his skin. People who'd built their lives on hard ground and harder opinions, and who didn't have much patience for strangers, especially ones who showed up on foot in November with nothing but a beat-up bag and a look on their face like they were already planning something. Mirelle arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. She was 18 years old and she was large, broad-shouldered, thick-waisted, the kind of body that people in Iron Hollow immediately noticed and immediately formed opinions about. She had her grandfather's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn mouth and a blister forming on her left heel that she absolutely refused to limp from. She walked straight down the main road of Iron Hollow like she had an appointment to keep, even though she had nowhere to be and no one expecting her and exactly $4.60 to her name. The first person who spoke to her was a woman sweeping the steps of a dry goods store. She didn't look up when she said it. "Passing through?" "Looking to stay," Mirelle said. The woman looked up then, took in Mirelle's size, her worn coat, the patches on her boots, looked back down. She said, and kept sweeping. That mem carried a whole sentence inside it. Mirelle had heard that sentence before. She kept walking. She had one real plan, which had come to her 3 days ago while she was sitting in a ditch eating the last of the cornbread she'd packed, reading through her grandfather's field notebook for the 4th time. The notebook was falling apart, the spine cracked, half the pages water-stained, but it was the most valuable thing she owned. Her grandfather, Ezra Ashcombe, had been what polite people called an eccentric, and what everyone else called a lunatic. He'd spent 30 years studying old building methods, the kind that indigenous peoples and ancient farmers had used for centuries before someone decided that wood frames and tin roofs were civilization. He drew everything: cross-sections of earthen walls, diagrams of round structures and how they distributed wind load, notes on thermal mass and how a thick clay wall could hold a day's heat through the coldest night. Mirelle had grown up sitting on his porch listening to him explain things that nobody else wanted to hear. And when he died, 2 years before Margaret kicked her out, he'd left her nothing but the notebook and 12 words. The old ways work. Build round. Trust the earth. Don't let them rush you. She hadn't understood it then. She was starting to now. On the eastern edge of Iron Hollow, set back from the road behind a rusted fence and a lot of scrub brush, stood an abandoned grain silo. Steel shell, maybe 30 feet across, half the roof panels buckled or missing. It had been empty for at least a decade, maybe longer. The ground around it was littered with broken equipment and old fence posts, and someone had spray-painted the word "condemned" on the side in red letters that had faded to pink. Mirelle stood in front of it for a long time. She walked around it twice, slowly, running her hand along the corrugated steel. She knocked on the wall in a few places, listening. She crouched and examined where the base met the ground, checking for rot in the concrete footing. She opened her grandfather's notebook and compared what she saw to a sketch he'd made of a similar structure in 1947. Then she climbed the fence, sat down inside the silo on the bare concrete floor, and ate the last apple in her bag. She was going to live here. She'd already decided. The question wasn't whether. It was how fast she could make it safe before the real cold came. She slept that first night wrapped in her coat with the satchel under her head, and she was cold enough that she woke up 3 times. But she woke up. That felt like something. In the morning, she went into town with her $4.60 and bought a small notebook, 2 pencils, a block of hard soap, and a piece of jerky. She sat on the steps of the hardware store, not inside, because the man behind the counter had watched her come in with an expression that made her feel like shoplifting was already being assumed, and she made a list. Clay, straw, stones for a stove base, timber for framing the interior, a door, tools she didn't have, labor she couldn't afford. She crossed out the last 2 immediately and stared at what was left. A man in a wide-brimmed hat stepped over her legs without saying, "Excuse me," and went inside. A pair of women walking past glanced at her and then at each other with small private smiles. Mirelle wrote Clay's source at the top of the list and underlined it 3 times. She spent the rest of that morning walking the land around Iron Hollow, the same way her grandfather had taught her to read a place before you tried to build in it. She found the creek bed a half-mile east. She found a clay deposit along a cut bank where the water had eroded the hillside, the kind of dense gray-blue clay that Ezra had described in the notebook as nearly ideal for thermal mass construction. She dug into it with a stick, rolled a piece between her fingers, felt it hold its shape without crumbling. She said out loud to nobody, "Okay, Grandpa, I'm starting to believe you." The first time she brought a wheelbarrow load of clay through town, people stared. She'd borrowed the wheelbarrow, not stolen, borrowed, from an abandoned lot. And she'd loaded it with the first serious haul from the creek bank, and she was pushing it down the main road because it was the flattest route to the silo. The clay was heavy, and the wheelbarrow's left wheel had a wobble in it that fought her the whole way, and she was sweating through her coat in the November cold, and her face was probably not making her look particularly friendly. "What in the world?" said a man standing outside the saloon. She didn't answer. She kept pushing. Hey, big girl, what are you doing with all that mud?" She stopped. Not because the words stung, they did, but she'd made a decision somewhere around mile 3 of her walk to Iron Hollow that she was not going to let this town see her flinch. She stopped because the wheelbarrow wheel had caught on a rut, and she needed a second to work it free. "Building," she said, without looking at him. "Building what?" "A home." A beat of silence, then laughter. Not his alone. There were 3 other men nearby, and they all found this funny in the way that men find things funny when the joke is someone else's dignity. "In the old silo," somebody said, "that thing's condemned." "Not structurally," Mirelle said. "The shell is sound. It's the roof that needs work." "You an engineer now?" She got the wheel free. She started pushing again. "I'm someone who read the right books," she said. More laughter. She kept moving. Sheriff Dale Orvet found her at the silo 3 days later. She'd already made 4 more clay runs and had started stacking a test section of earthen wall along the interior curved surface, following her grandfather's instructions. Almost exactly, packing the clay in layers and tamping each one down before adding the next. It was slow, exhausting work, and her hands were cracked from the wet clay and the cold air, and she had a bruise on her right knee from where she'd fallen off a makeshift scaffold the day before. Orvet was a reasonable man, which in Iron Hollow meant he was slightly less dismissive than everyone else. He stood at the fence and watched her work for a minute before he called out, "Miss, you can't live here." Mirelle didn't stop working. "Good morning, Sheriff." "This property belongs to the Crane family. Virgil Crane's grandfather built this silo." "I know. I asked around." She tamped another layer. "Virgil Crane hasn't paid property taxes on this land in 11 years. Under the county abandonment statute that opens it to adverse possession after a period of continuous use." A pause. "Where'd you learn about adverse possession?" "My grandfather's lawyer explained it to me when I was 15, in case I ever needed it." She sat back on her heels and finally looked at him. "Sheriff, I'm not hurting anyone. I'm not stealing anything. I'm making an uninhabitable structure habitable, and I'm doing it on land that nobody has cared about for over a decade. If Virgil Crane wants to contest that, he's welcome to ride out here and do it in person." Orvet looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the wall section she'd been building, really looked at it, the way a man looks at something when he's trying to find the flaw and isn't immediately finding it. "That's a strange way to build a wall," he said. "It's the old way." It works better than it looks. You really think you can make this place livable before winter sets in proper? I think I have to, she said. So yes. He pushed his hat up, scratched his forehead, and put it back down. I'll give you 2 weeks, he said. Then I need to see something that looks like actual progress. Or I'm going to have to ask you to move on. 2 weeks, she agreed. He left without saying goodbye. Mirelle turned back to the wall. 2 weeks. She had maybe 6 before the hard freeze. She tamped faster. The woman who brought her the straw was named Perla, and she was 81 years old and walked with a cane that she swung with more aggression than most people use their arms. She showed up on the 4th morning with a small cart loaded with dried straw bales and stood at the fence and yelled until Mirelle came out. I heard what you're doing, Perla said. Thought you might need this. Mirelle looked at the straw, at Perla. Why? Because I'm old and I remember things people in this town have decided to forget. She poked the cart with her cane. Straws for insulation. You know that already, I suppose. I do. Thank you. Mirelle paused. Can I ask who you are? Perla Voss. My husband built the first stone house in this valley before the Crane family decided wood was more fashionable. Stone house is still standing, by the way. The wood ones that replaced it had to be rebuilt twice. She looked past Mirelle at the silo. Your walls are going to curve. You're building them into the existing structure. Yes. Smart. Curves don't catch wind the same way. Something shifted in Mirelle's chest, the way it does when you've been alone with an idea for so long that you start doubting it, and then someone with old eyes looks at your work and nods. Nobody else thinks so, Mirelle said. Perla made a sound that was either a laugh or a cough. Nobody else in Iron Hollow has thought about anything correctly in 30 years. She turned to leave, then stopped. I heard some of the Darnell boys were planning to come out here and tip your clay loads over, just so you know. Mirelle went very still. When? Hard to say. Boys like that move when boredom and liquor meet. Perla started walking away. Build faster. The Darnell boys showed up on a Thursday evening. There were 3 of them. Tyler, who was 22 and had never needed a reason to be cruel, and his younger brothers Colt and Reed, who followed Tyler the way hungry dogs follow someone who's already found meat. Mirelle heard them before she saw them. She was inside the silo, working on the stone base for her stove by the light of a kerosene lamp, and she heard boots on gravel and the specific kind of laughter that means nothing good. She didn't hide. She thought about it for half a second and then decided against it, because hiding would mean spending every night afraid, and she hadn't come this far to do that. She walked outside and stood in the door of the silo, the section of wall she'd left open for a door, with her clay-covered hands at her sides. Tyler Darnell stopped when he saw her. He'd expected to find an empty site, or maybe a frightened girl who'd run at the sound of them. He hadn't expected someone standing like a wall herself. Silo girl, he said. Tyler, she said. He looked surprised she knew his name. You know who I am? I know who everyone in this town is. She kept her voice level. Small town. People talk. Your family runs the Eastern Ranch. Your father's name is Horace. Your mother left when you were 8. She watched his face change. I pay attention. Colt shifted uncomfortably. Reed looked at the ground. Tyler's jaw tightened. We're just looking around. At night. On private land. She tilted her head. Okay. This isn't private land, it's condemned. Condemned buildings can still have trespass protections. I'd have to check the statute, she paused. I know a lot of statutes. Another moment. The kind where you can feel someone deciding whether to push forward or pull back. Tyler Darnell was the type who needed an audience to be brave, and his brothers weren't exactly performing bravery right now. He pointed at the wall she'd built inside. That's going to fall down in the first real wind. No, it won't. You're an 18-year-old girl with mud on your hands. You're not a builder. I'm exactly a builder, she said, and when the wind comes, you're going to remember I said that. She didn't know then how literal that would turn out to be. Tyler spat on the ground, not at her, but near enough to mean something, and jerked his head at his brothers. They left the way they'd come, kicking at gravel as they went. Mirelle stood in the doorway until the sound of them disappeared. Then she went back inside, sat down next to her half-finished stove base, and let her hands shake for exactly 60 seconds. Then she picked up a stone and kept working. The man who changed everything showed up on a Sunday morning when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the air smelled like it was already deciding to become something dangerous. He came on foot, which was unusual. Everyone in Iron Hollow rode or drove, and he was carrying a pack so large it looked like it should have toppled him, but he walked under it like he'd carried weight this way for 50 years, which, as it turned out, he had. His name was August Holt. He was 74 years old and had spent the last 4 decades trapping and surviving in the high country north of Iron Hollow, the kind of wilderness that swallowed people who weren't careful. He had a face that was less a face than a record of weather, and eyes that watched everything at once, the way people's eyes get when they've spent a long time in places where the things watching you don't have names. He stopped at the fence of the silo and looked at what Mirelle had built. He looked for a long time, then he said, "Who taught you to build a thermal wall?" "My grandfather." "What was his name?" "Ezra Ashcombe." Something crossed August Holt's face. Not quite recognition, something more complicated than that. Ezra built a round structure up in the high country, 1952. I sheltered in it once. It held 22 below zero, better than any wood cabin I ever slept in. Mirelle stood very still. She'd known her grandfather had built things. She hadn't known anyone else remembered them. "He never told me about that one," she said. "He probably told you about a dozen others." Holt shifted his pack. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside. He walked around the interior twice, examining her wall sections with his hands the way a doctor examines something he isn't sure about yet. He crouched next to her stove base and tapped the stones, listening to the resonance. He looked up at the roof panels and assessed the gaps with narrowed eyes. "You're good," he said, which felt like a different thing than "this is good." It felt like a judgment about her specifically, not just her work. "I'm learning," she said. "You're doing both." He set his pack down and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were tools. Real ones. Chisels, specialized trowels, a set of measuring instruments she'd only seen drawings of. "I'm passing through, heading south, but I've got a few days." He looked at her. "You're going to need the roof sealed before the weather breaks." "I know." "And you'll want a second air channel in the east wall. Circular structures can trap smoke if you don't get the convection right." She pulled out her grandfather's notebook and flipped to a page she'd read 50 times. There it was, a small diagram of exactly what he was describing, with a note in the margin that said, "Critical in round structures, don't skip." She showed it to Holt. He looked at the notebook, looked at her. "You've been building from this?" "Everything I know is in there." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you already know what I'm going to tell you next." He reached into his pack and unfolded a hand-drawn map on yellowed paper. His own, clearly, covered in his cramped notations. He pointed to a series of marks in the high country to the north. "I've been watching the signs for 3 weeks," he said. "The way the animals are moving, the pressure patterns, the ice on the high lakes." He paused. "There's a winter coming, not a regular one. The kind that comes once in a generation and erases things." Mirelle looked at the map. "How long do I have?" she asked. 6 weeks, maybe 7 if it stalls in the mountains. He looked up at the silo's damaged roof. "But you're going to need every day of it." She didn't say anything for a moment. In her mind, she was running numbers, clay loads, wall thickness, the stove capacity she'd need, the ventilation, the food storage, the insulation in the roof panels, all of it. "Then we better start," she said. And they did. What Mirelle didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known, was that 6 weeks from that morning, the people who'd laughed at the silo girl would be standing in a blizzard with nowhere to go, that the men who'd mocked her would be knocking on her door, that the town of Iron Hollow, which had decided she was nothing, would discover that she was the only thing standing between them and freezing to death. She didn't know any of that yet. She just knew she had work to do, and a grandfather who had trusted her with every tool she needed, and a winter that was coming whether Iron Hollow was ready or not. She picked up her trowel. She built. August Holt stayed 4 days. That was 2 more than he'd promised, and Mirelle never asked him why he extended his stay, because she understood that some things don't survive being said out loud. He was an old man who had spent decades alone in the mountains, and he had walked into a place where someone was doing exactly what he believed in, and maybe that was enough. Maybe he just needed to see it through a little further before he could leave it behind. They worked from first light to last light every day, and they didn't talk much while they were working. Holt was the kind of man who believed conversation was for evenings, not for building. But what they accomplished in those 4 days was more than Mirelle had managed in the 10 before. He knew things that weren't in her grandfather's notebook. Small corrections, mostly. The angle of a trowel when packing clay into a curve. How to read the moisture content of the mix by the way it pulled away from your palm. How to set a stone in a stove base so that when it expanded with heat, it locked tighter instead of splitting the mortar. "You're doing this right," he told her on the second evening, when they were sitting on the floor eating canned beans that Mirelle had traded 2 hours of fence mending for. The circular structure, the thermal mass, the way you're positioning the stove off-center. Grandpa's notebook had the stove centered. "Your grandfather was right about almost everything, but centered stoves and round structures create hot spots on one side and dead zones on the other. Off-center, you get even distribution." He scraped his spoon around the bottom of his can. "I found that out by freezing my left side 3 winters in a row." Mirelle almost smiled. He'd have wanted to know that. He would have argued with me about it for an hour first. He argued with everyone about everything. She paused. "Did you know him well?" "Not well. We crossed paths 3 times over 30 years. Men like your grandfather. They don't make friends easy. They're too busy being right about things nobody believes yet." He looked at her. "You're like him that way." She didn't answer because she wasn't sure if it was a compliment. On the morning of the 5th day, she woke up and he was gone. His pack was gone, his tools were gone, and the only evidence he'd been there was a piece of paper folded under her kerosene lamp. She opened it. It was a sketch, his handwriting, not her grandfather's, of a wind deflection berm, a low earthen mound that would be built just north of the silo's entrance to redirect the worst of the wind around the door instead of slamming it directly. Below the sketch he'd written 3 words, "Build this first." She looked at the sketch for a long time. Then she put it in her grandfather's notebook, where it has stayed in this story ever since. She built the berm that afternoon. What? The problem with Iron Hollow wasn't that the people were cruel. Cruelty implies a kind of focus, a decision. What Iron Hollow had instead was indifference dressed up as mockery, which is somehow worse, because at least cruelty sees you. Indifference just keeps walking past. Mirelle felt it most acutely in the mornings, when she made her supply runs into town. She'd learned which stores would actually sell to her without making it unpleasant, and which ones were worth avoiding. The dry goods store near the north end of Main Street had a woman named Greta behind the counter who was businesslike and fair and never once looked at Mirelle's body like it was commentary. The hardware store on the corner was a different story. The owner, a man named Calloway, had a way of calling her little lady that managed to be condescending in 2 directions at once. She was in Calloway's hardware store on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after she'd arrived, trying to price out metal flashing for the roof repair. She needed to seal the gaps in the existing steel panels, and metal flashing was the most practical solution, faster than fabricating a replacement, watertight if installed correctly, and something she could do herself with the right tools. Calloway was showing her the options with the particular energy of a man who didn't think she'd buy anything, which made him less helpful than he would have been with a paying customer he respected. "The 20 gauge is what you'd want for that application," he said, in the tone of someone explaining things to a child. "Assuming you actually know how to work with metal." "I've worked with metal," Mirelle said. "On what?" "My grandfather's workshop. We did tin work, copper work, some light steel fabrication." She picked up a piece of the flashing and examined the gauge herself. "This is closer to 22, actually. That's fine for the application, but I'd want a lap joint rather than a butt joint at the seams." Calloway stared at her. Behind her, near the door, a man laughed. She turned around. It was one of the men from the saloon, not Tyler Darnell, but a similar type, sunburned and certain of himself. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "You hear this?" he said, to nobody and everybody. Silo girls explaining metalwork to Calloway. "I'm not explaining anything to Mr. Calloway," Mirelle said, turning back to the counter. "I'm explaining what I need. Those are different things." She set the flashing down. "I'll take 40 linear feet of the 22 gauge and a box of the hex head screws in the 3rd row there. The ones with the neoprene washers." Calloway rang her up without speaking. She paid, loaded the flashing into the cart she'd borrowed from Perla Voss. She'd been returning it every few days, and Perla had eventually just told her to keep it, and walked back toward the silo. The man from the doorway followed her outside and called after her. Hey, serious question. She kept walking. I'm being serious. What do you think you're doing out here? You're an 18-year-old girl living in a condemned grain bin. You don't have family here. You don't have money. You don't have... He waved a hand, searching for the right word. Prospects. Mirelle stopped. She turned around slowly. The man had an honest face, which made it worse somehow. He wasn't being cruel. He genuinely didn't understand. What's your name? She asked. Frank Ludlow. Frank, how old is your house? He blinked. What? Your house. How old is it? I don't know. 30 years, maybe. And how often have you had to repair the roof? Couple times. Every big winter does some damage. Right. She shifted the cart handle in her hands. The structure I'm building has walls 2 feet thick made of thermal mass clay and straw. A round shape that distributes wind load evenly instead of catching it flat on. A stove positioned to heat by convection, not just radiation. When the next bad winter hits, and one will, Frank, they always do, your 30-year-old house is going to lose its roof again. She paused. Mine won't. Frank Ludlow looked at her the way people look at someone who has said something that almost makes sense and that they're not quite ready to accept. You don't know that, he said. No, she agreed. I don't know it yet. She started walking again. But I will. She didn't let herself be angry. Not most of the time. That was a discipline, and it cost her something real. There were nights when she lay on the sleeping platform she'd built into the interior wall, packed clay, firm but manageable, with a layer of dried grass under her bedroll. And she thought about Margaret's boot in her back and the door closing and the lock turning, and she felt something hot and coiled in her chest that she knew was fury. Pure, clean, and completely useless. Because fury was energy, and energy was finite, and she needed every bit of it for the work. The walls were coming along. She'd completed the first full interior ring, a continuous earthen wall 18 inches thick at its base, following the curve of the existing steel structure and insulating it from the inside. She'd left deliberate gaps for the door opening, for the 2 ventilation channels August Holt had told her to include, and for a window she was planning to frame with salvaged timber. The walls weren't beautiful. They were uneven in places, darker where the clay had dried faster, with fingerprints and trowel marks visible in the surface. But they were solid. She'd hit them with her fist in a dozen places and felt nothing move. The stove was harder. She'd never built a stove from scratch before, only watched her grandfather do it twice and read his notes about it maybe 30 times. The principle was straightforward: a firebox of fitted stones, a heat exchange chamber above it, a flue that drew up and out through a gap she'd created in the existing roof. But the practice was a series of problems that each revealed a new problem inside them. The first test fire nearly smoked her out. She'd misjudged the draw angle of the flue, and the smoke found the inside of the silo faster than the outside. She came out coughing, eyes streaming, and stood in the cold air for 10 minutes, thinking hard. She went back in and rebuilt the flue angle. 3 degrees steeper. Second test fire was better. Still some backflow when the wind came from the northeast, which was the worst direction. She spent a day studying the existing roof structure, figured out that there was a low-pressure area forming on the lee side of the remaining roof panels that was disrupting the draft, and added a short metal cowl to the flue exit, a directional cap that turned the opening away from the prevailing wind. Third test fire was clean. The stove drew beautifully. The heat moved around the interior in exactly the convection pattern her grandfather's notebook had predicted, and by the time she let the fire burn down to coals that evening, the interior of the silo was warmer than any room she'd slept in since before her mother died. She sat on the floor next to the cooling stove and pressed her back against the earthen wall and felt the warmth the wall had stored during the fire, still radiating outward into the space, slow and steady. This, she thought, this is what he meant. It was the 5th week when things in town got bad enough to matter. She'd been aware of the various opinions circulating about her. You couldn't avoid it in a town this size, but she'd been able to mostly ignore them because opinions didn't weigh anything, and Clay did. What changed in the 5th week was that the opinions started organizing themselves into action. It started with Virgil Crane. Virgil was 53 years old, owned a substantial piece of land on the western side of the valley, and had approximately no interest in the abandoned silo until the moment he heard that someone was living in it and improving it. That was when it became, in his mind, a matter of principle. He arrived at the silo on a Wednesday morning with a document that he held at arm's length, the way people hold things they want you to understand they're serious about. He was a large man, well-dressed for Iron Hollow standards, with the particular confidence of someone who had always had enough money that other people's problems felt optional. "This is a notice of trespass," he said without preamble. Mirelle was on the roof, working on a section of flashing. She came down the makeshift ladder, 2 long poles with cross rungs she'd lashed herself, and took the document from him. She read it. It was a standard form, partially handwritten, with a county seal on it that looked genuine. "Your family hasn't paid property taxes on this land in 11 years, she said. "That's a private financial matter, with public record consequences." She handed the document back. "I filed for adverse possession with the county clerk. My filing date is 3 weeks ago. The statutory period in this county is 5 years of continuous, open, and hostile use. But there are provisions for accelerated claims under abandonment conditions." She met his eyes. "I have a lawyer friend in the next county who is handling the paperwork on contingency." She did not have a lawyer friend. She had a letter she'd written herself, based on statutes she'd read in the county law library, which she'd mailed to a real lawyer 2 weeks ago and had not yet received a response to. But Virgil Crane didn't know that. "You're bluffing," he said. "File the eviction and find out," she said pleasantly. He looked at the silo, at the earthen berm, the repaired roof panels, the door she'd framed out of salvaged timber, at the walls visible through the doorway, thick and purposeful. "What are you even building?" he said, and for a moment he sounded less hostile and more genuinely puzzled. "What's the point of all this?" "A warm place to live," she said. "And eventually, probably, proof that your grandfather's silo could have served this town better than anyone knew." Something shifted in his face, not quite softening, but a hairline crack in the certainty. Then he put the document under his arm and walked back to his horse. He didn't return, but he also didn't stop talking to people. The gossip that started circulating after Virgil's visit had a sharper edge than the usual mockery. Before, people had mostly laughed at the silo girl, the fat young woman playing at being a builder, mud up to her elbows, hauling clay in a borrowed cart. It had been entertainment. Now there was something else underneath it, a prickliness, because she'd been there 5 weeks, and the structure was visibly not falling down, and that made some people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate, and so expressed as hostility. She noticed it most clearly the day a group of women from the Ladies' Charitable Society of Iron Hollow, which was the official name, and Mirelle thought about it often, came out to the silo to look. They came in a group of 4, dressed better than the weather warranted, and they stood at the fence and inspected what she'd built the way you inspect something at a county fair that you're not sure deserves the ribbon it got. The oldest of the 4, a woman named Harriet Moss, whose husband owned the feed store, spoke for all of them. "It's very unusual," she said. "Thank you," Mirelle said. "That wasn't meant as a compliment." "I know. I was choosing to take it as one anyway." Harriet Moss blinked. The woman beside her, younger, maybe 35, with a pinched expression that suggested she spent a lot of time being disappointed, said, "We're worried about property values. An occupied structure like this, in this condition, could affect—" "The assessed value of this property is currently 0, Mirelle said, "because of the 11 years of unpaid taxes. Whatever I do here improves the taxable value, which helps the county, not hurts it." "You've been reading county records," Harriet said. "I read everything I can get access to." "Why?" Mirelle looked at her steadily. "Because I'm an 18-year-old woman alone in a town that doesn't want her. Reading is the cheapest form of armor I know." A silence. The women exchanged glances in that particular way that means a conversation will happen later that you won't be invited to. Then they left, walking back toward town with their heads together. Mirelle watched them go. Then she went inside and made herself tea on the stove and sat with her hands wrapped around the tin cup and breathed in the warmth of the walls. She allowed herself 3 minutes of feeling very tired. Then she went back to work. The person she least expected help from was Tyler Darnell. Not help exactly. What happened was more complicated than that, and it started with an accident. She was on the ladder doing roof work on a Thursday afternoon. The flashing on the northeast quadrant was giving her trouble. a section where the original steel panel had warped and wouldn't seat flat, when the left pole of her ladder slid on the wet concrete footing and the whole thing went sideways. She tried to catch herself and mostly succeeded, catching the edge of a roof panel with both hands and hanging for a moment before dropping. And the drop wasn't far, but it wasn't clean either, and she landed on her right ankle in a way that made a sound she didn't like and sent a white bolt of pain up to her knee. She sat on the ground and did not say anything for a full minute, which was its own kind of discipline. She pressed on the ankle carefully. Not broken. She'd broken a bone once before, at 13, and knew what that felt like. Badly sprained, which meant swollen and useless for at least 3 days, 4 if she was unlucky, and she needed to be on the ladder in the next 72 hours to finish the flashing before the weather turned. She was sitting there calculating this with the particular grimness of someone whose schedule does not accommodate injury when she heard boots on gravel and looked up and found Tyler Darnell standing at the fence. He looked at her ankle. He looked at the fallen ladder. He looked at the roof, where the unfinished flashing section was visible. "That looked bad," he said. "It's fine." "It's not." He came through the fence without being invited, which annoyed her, but she also noted that his face didn't have the smirk it usually carried. He crouched next to her and looked at the ankle with the practical eye of a ranch hand who has seen enough injuries to categorize them. "You can walk on it?" She tried. She could. Barely, and with a gait that was more controlled falling than walking. "You need to stay off it," he said. "I need to finish the flashing." "Not today, you don't." "Tyler," she stopped. "Why are you here?" He straightened up. He put his hands in his coat pockets and looked away, at the berm, at the walls visible through the door. "I was riding past," he said, which was not an answer because the silo wasn't on a route that anyone rode past casually. "Okay," she said. Not accepting it, just filing it. He was quiet for a moment, then, "My mother used to talk about roundhouses. She was from the Southwest originally. Her people built them, way back." He kept looking away. "I always thought it was just stories." Mirelle was quiet. "When she left, she didn't take anything except a photograph." He kicked at a piece of gravel. "I used to think it was a picture of us kids. Took me 12 years to find out it was a picture of the house she grew up in." Something moved in Mirelle's chest. She didn't reach for it. It was his, not hers. "I'm sorry," she said. He shrugged, which was the only way he knew to receive sympathy. "I'll get the ladder reset. Tell me where you need the flashing seated." She told him. He went up the ladder with the confidence of a man who had been on barn roofs since he was 8, and he spent an hour on the northeast quadrant while Mirelle sat on an overturned bucket and talked him through the process. The lap joint angles, the screw spacing, the bead of tar sealant along the upper edge. He did what she told him, and he did it correctly, and he didn't make it weird. When he came down, she said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't tell anyone." She almost smiled. "Why?" "Because I have a reputation." He said it without irony, which told her something. He picked up his hat, which he'd set on the fence post. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think you're going to fail. I thought you were going to at first. I don't anymore." Then he left, and Mirelle sat with that for a long time, not because she needed his approval. She'd stopped needing anyone's approval somewhere around the third clay hall, but because it was the first honest thing anyone in Iron Hollow who wasn't 80 years old had said to her, and honesty, it turned out, was something she'd been hungrier for than she'd realized. The weeks compressed after that. She stopped counting days and started counting completed sections. Wall segment, roof panel, stove test, food storage, ventilation channel, door seal. She had built a clay and stone food larder into the thickest section of the north wall, deep enough that it would hold a consistent temperature regardless of what the air did outside. She'd stacked dried provisions, beans, hard cheese, dried meat, grain, salt, with the kind of systematic care that her grandfather had always brought to his preparedness work. The care of someone who knows that running out of something in February is a completely different problem than running out of it in June. She'd also begun, quietly, making space. Not just for herself. The interior of the silo was 30 feet across, and with the walls built in, the habitable circle was still close to 24 feet in diameter. She'd built her own sleeping platform, her stove, her larder, her work area. But there was floor space remaining, and she left it clear in a way that wasn't accidental. She put in a second set of hooks near the door. She built a second tier of larder shelving on the east wall that she didn't fill with her own provisions. She told herself she didn't know why. She told herself it was just good building practice to leave flexible space. But she'd listened to August Holt's warnings about the winter, and she'd watched the high country every morning the way he'd taught her to watch it, and what she saw in the sky to the north, in the quality of the clouds, in the way the wind came down the valley in patterns she was starting to read like a language, told her that the old trapper hadn't been exaggerating. Something was coming. An iron hollow, with its wood frame houses and tin roofs and 30-year-old repairs, was not ready for it. She was building for herself. She was also, without quite admitting it yet, building for whatever happened after. Sheriff Orvet came back on the 6th week, as he'd promised. He came alone, mid-morning, and he didn't call from the fence this time. He came through the gate and knocked on the timber doorframe, which was a different kind of visitor than he'd been before. She opened the door. He looked past her into the interior. He was quiet for a while, and she let him be quiet, because she could see him revising something in his head, and revision takes time. The walls were finished. The stove was proven. The floor was packed earth over a gravel drainage layer, one of her grandfather's touches, to prevent moisture wicking. And she'd laid woven reed mats over most of it, traded for with 3 days of work for a farming family on the south edge of the valley. The larder was full. The roof was sealed. 2 kerosene lamps hung from iron hooks she'd set into the beam she'd run across the interior, and in their light the curved walls had a warm amber quality to them. It looked unmistakably like a home. "How warm does it get in here?" Orvet asked. "With the stove running moderately, the interior stays at 58 to 62 degrees through the night, even when it's below freezing outside." She paused. "Once the walls are fully heat-saturated, that takes about 3 days of regular firing. The temperature holds even if the fire goes out completely for 6 to 8 hours." He turned around and looked at her. "The 2 weeks I gave you," he said, "I was wrong about you." "You were doing your job," she said. "I don't fault you for that." "That's generous." "Not really. I just don't have energy for resentment right now." She picked up her tin coffee pot and held it up in question. He nodded, and she poured 2 cups and handed him one. "Sheriff, do you know anything about the Crane property tax situation?" "Some." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "Virgil Crane is complicated. He's got land wealth and cash problems, which is common out here. He's been putting the taxes off, hoping the land value would climb enough to make it worth resolving." "Has he filed the eviction?" "He's talked about it." Orvet sipped the coffee. His expression shifted slightly. "He's talked to the county judge. The judge told him adverse possession cases are slow and uncertain, and that the current occupant appears to have a credible claim." He looked at her. "The judge said whoever filed that legal brief knew what they were doing." Mirelle said nothing. "The lawyer whose name is on the brief is real," Orvet said. "I checked. Practices 2 counties over." "She is real," Mirelle confirmed. "She agreed to review my self-prepared brief and put her name on it for a consultation fee." A pause. 75 cents and a pound of dried beans. Something happened in Orvet's face that was close to a smile, though not quite. "You're something else," he said. "I'm someone who does her homework," she said. "Sheriff, what do you think is coming this winter?" He looked at her over the rim of his cup. His expression changed, the official face dropping away, something more genuine underneath. And underneath that was something she recognized. It was worry. "Old-timers are talking," he said carefully, "saying the signs are bad, the way the elk have moved early. The ice on Archer Creek was 3 weeks ahead of schedule." He put the cup down. "I've been in this valley 15 years. I've seen hard winters. But the ones before me talk about something different every 40 or 50 years. A winter that doesn't just damage things. One that—" He stopped. "Erases them," Mirelle said. He looked at her. "Yes. August Holt told me the same thing 6 weeks ago." Orvet straightened slightly. "You talked to August Holt?" "He worked here for 4 days. He helped me with the stove and the roof." She looked at the walls. "He's been up in the high country all summer. He knows what the signs mean up there better than anyone." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. She watched him doing the calculation that she'd done weeks ago, and she watched him arrive at the same place she had, because it wasn't a complicated calculation. "Your structure," he said slowly. "How many people could it shelter in an emergency?" She looked around the interior. She'd already run these numbers. She'd run them 3 times, from different angles. Comfortably, 4 to 6. She paused. In an emergency, people sitting close, sharing heat, not worrying about comfort, 20 to 25. 20 to 25, Ma, he repeated. The earthen walls and the stove are the variables. The stove can heat this space for as many people as can fit, as long as I have fuel. The walls hold the heat regardless of occupancy. She met his eyes. Sheriff, I'm not trying to save this town. I built this place for myself. But if the winter is what August Holt thinks it is and people need shelter, I'm not going to close the door on them. Orvette set down his cup. He looked at her for a long time with the particular expression of a man who is being forced to revise a lot of assumptions at once and doesn't quite know where to put them all. The people in this town haven't been kind to you, he said. No. And you'd still be... They're people, she said simply. I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it because it's what you do. He picked up his hat. I'm going to start suggesting people winterize more thoroughly this year, he said, which was not quite an acknowledgement and not quite a thank you, but was somewhere in between. That's a good idea, she said. He left. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Iron Hollow, Mirelle felt something she hadn't had in weeks. Not confidence, exactly, and not peace. Something smaller and more real than either of those. The feeling of having done the right work at the right time. Of having listened to what the situation required and answered it. She let it last for as long as she could. Then she checked the larder inventory again, noted what was still missing, and went out to start the next haul. Outside, the sky to the north was the color of bruised pewter. The wind came down the valley in a long, cold exhale. A single hawk circled once over the silo, then turned south and flew hard, like it had somewhere better to be. Mirelle watched it go. She went back inside and stoked the stove and picked up her grandfather's notebook and turned to the page she'd read more times than any other. The one with the cross-section diagram of the round structure. The convection arrows. The note about thermal mass holding heat for hours after the fire drops. And she read it one more time. Not because she needed to. Because Ezra Ashcombe had known something that most of the world had forgotten, and keeping his words alive in her mind felt like the one thing she owed him. She closed the notebook. Set it beside the stove. Looked at the walls she had built with her own hands, out of the earth she had carried on her own back, with the knowledge an old man had pressed into a notebook and then pressed into her. The walls were 2 feet thick at the base. They would take the wind the way a river takes a stone, by letting it break itself against something that had no intention of moving. She knew what was coming. She had known for weeks. She just hadn't known yet how many people would end up inside these walls when it arrived, looking at her with the specific shame of people who had laughed at the wrong person at the wrong time. That part was still coming, and the sky to the north was not waiting much longer. The sky changed on a Saturday. Not dramatically, not the way storms announce themselves in stories. No single crack of thunder, no sudden darkness dropping like a curtain. It was subtler than that, and more frightening for being subtle. The light went wrong first. The particular quality of the morning sun flattened out into something gray and directionless, the kind of light that makes distances hard to judge and shadows disappear. Then the wind stopped. Not slowed, stopped, completely, in the way that wind only stops when something larger than ordinary weather is reorganizing itself above the clouds. Mirelle had been awake since before dawn. She'd woken with the feeling she couldn't name and had lain on her sleeping platform for 10 minutes listening to the silence, which was different from the usual silence, heavier and more deliberate, before she got up and fed the stove and went outside. She stood at the top of the earthen berm August Holt had sketched for her, and she looked north. The mountains were gone, not in cloud, in something thicker than cloud, a white wall that sat at the horizon and occupied the full width of the sky from east to west, a thing so large it had its own gravity. She had never seen a weather system with visible edges at that scale. It looked less like a storm than like a decision the atmosphere had made. She went back inside. She did not panic. Panic was for people who hadn't prepared, and she had been preparing for exactly this for 7 weeks. She stoked the stove to full burn and fed it until the firebox was packed as tightly as it could take. She checked her fuel stack, split wood inside, more stacked outside under the oilcloth she'd weighted down with stones 2 weeks ago in anticipation. She went through the larder methodically, not to reassess, but to confirm. 40 pounds of dried beans, 20 of hard grain, 10 of salt-cured meat, hard cheese wrapped in wax cloth, root vegetables packed in sand, 6 gallons of water in sealed crocks, and enough dried herbs that the whole north wall smelled like something between a kitchen and a pharmacy. She counted the extra bedrolls she'd acquired over the past month, trading labor, borrowing, one she'd found in the abandoned equipment lot, and cleaned and patched. 8 of them. Not enough. She'd known they wouldn't be enough and had known it anyway. She brought the outside fuel stack inside. All of it, trip by trip, stacking it along the curved south wall until that section of the silo looked like a woodcutter's warehouse. Her arms were burning by the 4th trip, and on the 6th, she stumbled on the threshold and went down hard on one knee on the packed earth floor and stayed there for a moment, breathing, before she got back up. She was halfway through the 7th trip when she heard the first sound. It came from the north, which was the direction she'd been watching, and it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like a very large, very distant machine, or like a river running over stones, but scaled up to something that made the air vibrate at a frequency she felt in her back teeth more than her ears. A sound that had no business being that big. She set down the wood. She went to the door and looked north. The white wall was no longer at the horizon. It was maybe 4 miles away and it was moving fast. And it was not just a storm front, but an entire reorganization of the visible world. Snow and wind fused into a single mass that had erased the distance between the mountains and the valley floor, and was now in the process of erasing everything else. She could see the edge of it, crossing the northern ranch land, could see the fence posts on the Darnell property disappear one by one as the white consumed them. She estimated, 20 minutes before it hit the silo. She made a decision she'd been turning over in her mind for 2 weeks, never quite committing to it. She grabbed her heaviest coat, her hat, her gloves, and she ran. What? The main road of Iron Hollow was not yet aware of what was coming. That was the thing that struck her most as she came down between a jog and a controlled panic, the ordinary texture of a Saturday morning still in place. The feed store was open. 2 men were talking outside the saloon. A woman was hanging washing on a line behind the boarding house with the specific optimism of someone who had not looked north in the last 10 minutes. Mirelle didn't slow down for any of them. She went straight to the sheriff's office and pushed the door open without knocking. Orvet was at his desk. He looked up, and whatever he saw on her face made him stand immediately. "It's here," she said. "Not coming. Here. You have 20 minutes, maybe less, before the road is impassable." He was already reaching for his coat. "How bad?" "I've never seen anything like it," August Holt said once in a generation. I believe him now. She stepped aside so he could come through the door. "Your wood-frame structures, the boarding house, the saloon, the feed store, you need to get people out of them. I can't evacuate the whole town in 20 minutes. Then get the ones in the weakest structures. The boarding house roof is already compromised. I noticed it 6 weeks ago. The ridgeline sags on the east side. If 2 feet of heavy snow hits that roof in an hour, it's coming down." He looked at her. Something passed between them. The memory of every conversation they'd had, every cautious, measured thing he'd said to her, and the fact that she was standing in front of him now, and she had been right about everything she'd said she was right about. "Where do they go?" he said. "The silo." He didn't hesitate. He put on his hat and walked out the door fast, and she followed him, and together they started moving down Main Street in the direction of the boarding house. The sound was audible now to everyone. She watched people come out of buildings and look north, and she watched their faces do the same thing hers had done an hour earlier. The slow, recalibrating recognition of something outside their experience. A child on the general store porch started crying without knowing why. Orvet had a voice made for emergencies, she discovered. Big and flat and carrying, the kind of voice that gets through noise. He used it now. "Everybody listen. Storm hitting in under 20 minutes. Anyone in the boarding house, the old mill building, or the east side bunk structures needs to move right now. Take what you can carry. You're going to the grain silo on the east edge of town." He pointed, though most people already knew where it was, having spent the last 2 months forming opinions about it. "Miss Ashcombe's structure on the east road. Move." A moment of the particular paralysis that groups of people experience when told to do something they haven't scheduled. Then Frank Ludlow. Frank from the hardware store doorway, Frank who'd asked her what the point of all this was, said, "I know where it is. Come on." And he started walking east, and people followed him because humans follow the first person who moves. Mirelle caught Orvet's sleeve. "Her Lavos. She's on the north end, alone." "I'll get her." She can't walk fast with the cane. You'll need to help her. I know, Perla. He was already moving north. Get back to the silo. Get that stove as hot as it'll go. She ran. The wind arrived while she was on the return trip, and the word arrived undersells it. The wind didn't arrive so much as install itself, turning on like a mechanism, going from stillness to 40 miles an hour in the space of about 30 seconds. She was 200 yards from the silo when it hit, and it hit her from behind and nearly took her off her feet, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees inside a minute. The kind of cold that is not just cold but aggressive, cold with intent. She bent into it and ran. Inside the silo, she went straight to the stove and opened the draft full and added wood until the firebox was as loaded as she could make it safely. Then she went to the door and stood in it and looked back toward town. They were coming. She could see figures in the snow, which was already driving horizontally, turning the road into something you navigated by feel and memory rather than sight. Frank Ludlow in front, moving with purpose. Behind him, a cluster of shapes she couldn't individuate yet. Behind them, more shapes, and behind those the white wall that was now Iron Hollow's entire northern sky. She started counting as they came through the gate. Frank. A woman she didn't know, carrying a baby wrapped in 2 coats. An older man with a limp she recognized as Mr. Garvey from the feed store. 2 young women from the boarding house, one of them still in an apron. A man with a boy of maybe 7 on his back. They came in and the silo swallowed them, and they stood in the interior and felt the heat from the walls, and some of them made sounds she didn't have words for. Not quite relief, something more involuntary than relief. The sound a body makes when it stops being in danger before the mind has caught up. Find a spot on the floor away from the stove, Mirelle said. Leave the area by the door clear. More people coming. More came. The Hendersons from the East Side bunkhouse, a family of 4. The father carrying their youngest on his shoulders. 2 of the Darnell ranch hands she recognized from the saloon incident. A woman named Clara, who ran the laundry and whom Mirelle had never once spoken to, but who grabbed her hand when she came through the door and held it for a full 3 seconds without saying anything. Then Orvette came in with Perla Voss on his arm, Perla's cane tucked under his other arm because the snow had made it useless. Perla herself upright and furious in the particular way of old women who are frightened but refuse to express it as fear. Ridiculous, Perla said to no one specifically. Absolutely ridiculous. Are you all right? Mirelle asked. I'm 81. I don't do all right. I do functional. She looked around the interior, at the walls, at the stove, at the 20-odd people arranging themselves on the floor. You built this. I built this. Perla made the sound that was either a laugh or a cough, and this time Mirelle was fairly certain it was a laugh. Your grandfather would be insufferable about this, she said, in the best possible way. Outside, the wind found another gear. Listen. The first sounds of structural failure started about 40 minutes after the storm hit. They came from the direction of town, not close enough to pinpoint, but present, unmistakable. A sound like a very large book closing hard, then a longer groan, then silence, then the same sound again from a different direction. Mirelle identified each one without wanting to, a roof giving way under snow load. The sequence was clean and terrible, the compression sounds of timber that has taken all it can take, and then the release. Inside the silo, people heard it too. That's the boarding house, said a man near the back wall. His voice was flat and certain. That's the east pitch going. Nobody answered him. The baby had stopped crying and was asleep against its mother's chest. The 7-year-old boy had fallen asleep too, against his father's leg, the pure animal sleep of a child whose nervous system has decided it has processed enough. Harriet Moss was there. Mirelle noticed her in the 3rd hour, sitting against the curved west wall with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression doing something complicated. Harriet, who had come to the fence with her charitable society and said very unusual in a tone that meant the opposite. She was here now because her house was a 30-year-old wood frame with a flattish roof, and her husband had apparently had the sense to bring her east when Orvette started shouting. Their eyes met across the interior. Harriet looked away first. Virgil Crane arrived in the 4th hour. He came in alone, without his document, without his horse, snow packed into the folds of his coat and his hat missing and his left hand wrapped in what appeared to be a piece of his own shirt tail. He stood in the doorway, and his eyes went around the interior with the specific expression of a man who was encountering a reality he had previously ruled out. Mirelle was by the stove. She looked at his hand. "What happened?" she said. "Fence wire," he said. "The north pasture fence. I was trying to get the horses into the far barn. The wire snapped back." "Come here." He came. She unwrapped the shirt tail and looked at the cut, deep, along the palm, bleeding steadily, but not arterially. She went to the larder and found her medical supplies: a clean cloth, a small bottle of antiseptic she'd paid a week's labor for, needle and thread she'd been using to patch bedrolls. "This needs a couple stitches," she said. He looked at his hand. He looked at her. "You can do that?" "I've done it before." On herself, twice, during the building work. Once for a gash from the metal flashing and once for a puncture from a misdriven nail. Neither had been pleasant experiences, but both had healed clean. "All right," he said. She threaded the needle in the light of the kerosene lamp, and she stitched Virgil Crane's hand while the storm made the earth itself seem to move. And he sat still and didn't make a sound except once, on the third stitch, a sharp intake of breath that he immediately controlled. When she was done, she wrapped the hand in clean cloth and tied it off. "Thank you," he said. The word sat in his mouth strangely, like it wasn't his native language. "Hold it above your heart for an hour," she said. "Slows the swelling." He nodded. He went and found a space along the east wall and sat down. He held his hand above his heart. He didn't talk to anyone. Well, by the 6th hour, there were 23 people in the silo. The stove was running at the level Mirelle had calculated could sustain the space for extended occupation. Not the full-blast emergency burn she'd started with, but a steady, controlled feed that would keep the interior temperature between 55 and 62 degrees without burning through her fuel supply in the first 12 hours. She'd already done the fuel math 3 times and had arrived at the same answer each time. If she managed the burn carefully, she had enough for 4 days. Maybe 4.5. That was the number that lived in the back of her mind while she moved through the space, checking on people, adjusting the stove, inventorying the food situation. 23 people, 4 days of fuel. The larder she'd stocked for one person's winter was now the larder for 23 people's survival, and she was going to have to be very precise about it. She sat down with her grandfather's notebook and did the food math at the back of an empty page. If she stretched the beans and grain into thin soups and rationed the salt meat as flavoring rather than protein, she could sustain basic caloric needs for 23 people for approximately 3.5 days. Not comfortably. Adequately. She was looking at the gap between 3.5 and 4 when Tyler Darnell appeared beside her. He'd come in during the 2nd hour with his brother Colt and 2 ranch hands, snow-covered and silent, and he'd gone directly to the far side of the space and sat down without looking at her. She'd noticed but hadn't approached. Now he crouched next to her and looked at the notebook page. "Food problem?" "Math problem," she said. "Same thing." "How many days?" 3.5 on food, 4 on fuel." She kept her voice low. 23 people. He was quiet, doing arithmetic she could see happening in his face. "What if we had more food?" She looked at him. "Where?" "I brought 2 saddlebags." He tilted his head toward the door. "Left them outside the berm when I came in. If the berm did its job, they're still accessible." She thought about it. The berm would have deflected the worst of the direct wind and snow accumulation from the door side. "Can you get to them?" "I think so. If someone's got a rope to tie off so I can find my way back." She looked at the interior. At the people sitting against walls, some asleep, some staring at nothing. The particular suspended animation of people who are waiting out something they can't control. She found the coil of rope she'd kept mounted on the south wall hook, 50 feet of good hemp rope, another piece of deliberate preparation. "I'll hold the other end," she said. He didn't argue about whether she was strong enough to be the anchor, which she appreciated. They rigged it at the door. He tied one end around his waist, and she braced herself against the timber doorframe with both hands on the rope, and he went out into the storm. What came back through the rope was information. She could feel when he was moving, when he stopped, when something resisted him. The cold came in through the open door, and people near the entrance made sounds of protest, and she ignored them because she was focused entirely on the rope in her hands. 4 minutes. 5. Then 2 tugs, the signal they'd agreed on, and she and Frank Ludlow, who had come to help without being asked, began pulling. Tyler came back through the door with a saddlebag over each shoulder and snow packed into every surface of him and a cut above his eyebrow from something he'd hit in the whiteout. He dropped the bags on the floor and bent over with his hands on his knees, breathing. Mirelle opened the bags. Dried beef jerky, a wheel of hard cheese, 4 cans of preserved peaches, a cloth sack of cornmeal, coffee beans. Not a lot, but the gap between 3.5 and 4 was smaller now. She looked up at Tyler. He was still bent over, catching his breath. "Thank you," she said. He straightened, touched the cut on his eyebrow, winced. "Don't tell anyone, so," he said for the second time. But this time there was something different in it. Less performance, more just habit. "Tyler," she said. He looked at her. "There's nothing embarrassing about being decent." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went and sat back down against the far wall, and she turned to the stove. The second night was the hardest. Not because the temperature dropped inside. It held, the walls doing exactly what 2 feet of thermal mass was supposed to do, the stove burning steady and clean. What made it hard was the sound. The storm had found its sustained voice, which was constant and enormous and completely indifferent to anything inside the silo. And it had been in that voice for 18 hours now, and the mind starts to erode under that kind of constant pressure. People who had been calm in the first hours became quieter, more internal, some of them brittle in ways that could break suddenly. The baby cried again in the small hours, and the mother, her name was Jessie, Mirelle had learned, 19 years old, and her husband was somewhere in the county doing a supply run when the storm hit, couldn't settle it. She walked the baby back and forth in the narrow, clear space near the stove, bouncing and shushing, and her face had the particular desperation of someone who is exhausted beyond the edge of their resources and still going. Mirelle went to her. "Can I take her for a while?" Jessie looked at her with the specific expression of a new mother being asked to hand over her child to a near stranger, and Mirelle understood that look and waited while Jessie decided. "Just for a few minutes," Jessie said, and held out the baby. Mirelle took her. She was a small, solid, furious person, this baby, red-faced and absolutely committed to her distress. Mirelle carried her to the warmest spot she'd identified in the interior, where the curve of the south wall caught and held the radiant heat from the stove most effectively, and she walked slowly back and forth in the way she'd seen her grandfather walk with baby animals in distress. Long, slow steps, the movement more horizontal than vertical. The baby didn't stop crying immediately, but she slowed, then slowed more, then made a sound that was more confused than upset, as if she was deciding whether the new situation was worth the effort of continued fury. She stopped. Mirelle kept walking. Old Perla, sitting against the south wall wrapped in 2 bedrolls, opened one eye. "You're good at that," she said. "She just needed something different," Mirelle said. "Most people do." Perla closed her eye. "You're walking the same pattern your grandfather used to use when he was thinking through a problem. Did you know that?" Mirelle hadn't known that. She thought about it, the long, slow, horizontal steps, and realized she'd been doing it since she was young, and she'd never connected it to him before. "What was he like?" she asked, quietly, so as not to wake anyone. "When you knew him." Perla was quiet for long enough that Mirelle thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, "Stubborn, brilliant, terrible at saying he was sorry, but he'd fix whatever he'd broken instead, which I always thought was the better apology anyway." A pause. "He loved you. He talked about you when he came through here 12 years ago. You were 6. He said you had the best eyes for structure he'd ever seen in someone who couldn't yet read a ruler." Mirelle held the sleeping baby and didn't say anything. "He would have liked to have seen this," Perla said. "I know," Mirelle said. On the morning of the second day, Harriet Moss came to find Mirelle. She found her at the stove, managing the morning burn, adjusting the draft, adding wood in the precise quantities she'd calibrated against the temperature she was trying to hold. Mirelle heard her coming and didn't turn around. "Can I speak with you?" Harriet said. "You're speaking with me." A pause. Harriet came around to where Mirelle could see her without turning. She looked different from the fence visit. The well-dressed certainty was still there in the bones of her posture, but something on top of it had shifted. "I owe you an apology," Harriet said. The words came out with the specific difficulty of words that have been held a long time and are stiff with it. "You don't have to. I do, actually." Harriet folded her hands. We came out here, my group. We said unkind things. We implied things about your competence and your—" She stopped. "Your appearance. We were not kind." Mirelle adjusted the draft. "No, you weren't. I want to say—" Harriet stopped again. "I'm not sure what I want to say. That I was wrong. That the way we treated you was wrong. Not just because you built the only structure standing in this storm, although—" She gestured at the walls briefly. "Also that." Mirelle finally turned and looked at her. Harriet Moss was maybe 55, with the well-kept appearance of a woman who had always had enough money to tend to herself, and she was standing in a packed clay floor grain silo in the middle of a catastrophic storm, with her hair loose and her dress wrinkled from sleeping on the ground, and she was making eye contact and not looking away. That, Mirelle thought, takes something. Maybe it takes almost dying. Maybe that's just what it cost. "Thank you for saying so," Mirelle said. "Is that—" Harriet seemed genuinely uncertain. "Is that enough?" "I don't know yet," Mirelle said, "but it's a start." Harriet nodded, once. She went back to her spot against the west wall, and Mirelle turned back to the stove, because the fire needed tending. The fire always needed tending, and there were 23 people depending on her ability to tend it. The third day was when people started getting on each other's nerves. There was no avoiding it. 23 people in a 30-foot circular structure, without adequate privacy, with limited food, with a continuous sound from outside that never paused, with the specific stress of not knowing how long it would last, or what they'd find when it ended. All of that creates friction. Human beings are not naturally good at this. The social machinery that keeps them civil in daily life runs on enough space and enough privacy and enough exit, and when you take all three away, what's underneath starts to surface. Mirelle had anticipated it. She'd thought about it during the building, when she was placing hooks and planning the layout, and she'd come to the conclusion that the best tools for it were tasks and warmth and something to listen to, in that order. The tasks she distributed carefully: who fed the stove each hour, who managed the water crocks, who checked the door seal for ice buildup, who tracked the food inventory. She gave people things to be responsible for because responsibility focuses the mind outward instead of inward. The warmth the stove handled. The something to listen to was harder and came from an unexpected source. On the evening of the third day, one of the ranch hands, a young man named Dobie, maybe 20, who had barely spoken since he arrived, pulled a battered harmonica out of his coat pocket and looked at it for a while and then played a single long note, like he was testing the air. The interior went quiet in a different way. He played 3 notes, stopped, played a phrase, something slow and not quite in a recognizable key. Improvised, feeling its way through the available emotional space. A few people looked up. The baby, who had been fussing, went still. He played for 45 minutes. He played things that weren't exactly songs, more like weather in musical form. Long phrases that rose and fell without resolving cleanly. The kind of playing that doesn't require you to know it to feel it. People listened with their eyes closed or their eyes open, and what was in their faces was not happiness exactly, but something that resembled it in the dark. When he stopped, nobody said anything for a moment. Then Perla said, from the south wall, "Again." He played again. Mirelle sat near the stove and listened and watched the firelight move on the curved earthen walls. And she thought about her grandfather's notebook and August Holt's map and the hawk that had flown south 3 days ago. And she thought, I built this. Not as pride, but she was past pride, or maybe pride was too small a word, more like witness. She was watching herself do a thing she hadn't known she could do, and the scale of it was still catching up with her. The storm shifted on the 4th morning, not ended, shifted. The sustained howl dropped to something more intermittent, gusts with gaps between them, and through those gaps there was a different quality to the light coming through the vented gaps in the roof. Whiter, cleaner, the light of sky that is beginning to clear rather than sky in the middle of catastrophe. Orvet woke early and came to find Mirelle near the stove. I think it's turning, he said. Maybe? She was not going to say yes until she was certain. She'd been managing these 23 people on information that was precise and measured, and she wasn't going to start speculating now. He looked at the walls, at the crowd of sleeping and waking people arranged across the packed earth floor, at the stove that had burned for 4 days without failure. How much fuel left, he said. 12 hours at current burn, less if it gets colder before it gets warmer. And we're still at 55? 56, actually. She'd been monitoring the temperature by feel and by a simple thermometer she'd made from a sealed tube of water and a marked scale. Her grandfather's design, which she'd built as a curiosity 2 weeks ago and was now deeply grateful for. Orvit sat down on a chunk of wood near the stove. He looked like a man who had aged 5 years and 4 days, but also like a man who had organized and managed 23 frightened people through that time and had done it reasonably well. He had rationed his own food, she'd noticed, had given his portion to Jessie twice when the baby was particularly difficult. What happens when it's over, he said. People go home. Some of them don't have homes anymore. He said it without drama. The boarding house roof, I heard it go on the first night. The old mill building, some of the east side structures. I know. There's going to be a lot of rebuilding. She said nothing. He looked at her. You know what they're going to ask you? I have an idea. Will you help? She was quiet for long enough that it wasn't silence anymore, but a considered pause. Outside, the wind came in one more long gust and then dropped away. And in the gap it left behind there was the particular quality of stillness that is different from the stillness before a storm. This was the stillness after, exhausted and changed. Ask me again when it's actually over, she said. Right now I'm still managing this. He nodded. He got up. He went to check on the people along the east wall because that was his nature. Not to sit when there was tending to be done. And Mirelle turned back to the stove and fed it one more piece of wood, the same way she'd fed it 1,000 times in the last 4 days, with the same attention and the same care, because the fire didn't know the storm was turning and it still needed tending, and she was still the one who knew how. Outside, the wind came one more time, a last long push, and then it let go. The silo stood in the sudden quiet the way it had stood through everything else, round and thick-walled and unchanged, holding its warmth against whatever the world had sent, exactly as it had been built to do. The wind was gone by mid-morning, not slowly gone, not gradually easing into something manageable. Gone the way a held breath releases all at once, and the silence that replaced it was so complete that people inside the silo woke from sleep or stirred from their half-conscious sitting and looked at each other with the dazed, uncertain expressions of people who have been surviving something and aren't yet sure whether they're allowed to stop. Mirelle was already awake. She'd been awake for the last 2 hours of the storm's final act, sitting near the stove with her grandfather's notebook open in her lap and not reading it, just holding it, listening to the wind lose its argument with the world outside. When the last gust died, she sat for a full minute in the quiet and breathed. Then she got up and opened the door. What she saw stopped her. Iron Hollow was white to a depth she hadn't calculated for, even knowing what August Holt had told her. The snow had drifted against every vertical surface in the landscape and sculpted itself into shapes that didn't look natural. 10-foot walls of packed white along the north side of the berm, a ramp of consolidated snow climbing the east face of the silo, nearly to the roofline, the road into town buried under what she estimated was 4 feet of settled depth, more in the places where the wind had worked. The sky above it was the specific blue that only exists after a major storm has scrubbed the atmosphere clean, a blue so sharp it almost had an edge. She could see the town from here, or what was left of its roofline. The boarding house roof was down on the east pitch, exactly as she'd predicted, the collapsed timber visible even at this distance as a dark irregular break in the white. The old mill building was worse. The front wall appeared to have failed entirely, leaving only 3 sides standing in a shape that was more ruins than building. 3 other structures along the main road showed various degrees of damage: missing roof panels, collapsed porches, one entire small outbuilding that had been reduced to a dark stain in the snow where its materials had spread. Her silo stood. She made herself look at it without sentiment, the professional assessment before the personal one. The roof flashing had held. The berm had done exactly what August Holt's sketch had promised, redirecting the dominant wind load around the entrance so the door seals had experienced maybe a third of the direct pressure they would have otherwise. The earthen walls showed no cracking, no settling, no evidence that 4 days of catastrophic wind had asked them any question they couldn't answer. She let herself feel something about that for approximately 30 seconds. Then she went back inside. 23 people waking up in a 30-foot circle after 4 days together have a specific atmosphere, and it is not an easy one. There is the smell, wood smoke and unwashed bodies, and the particular sourness of fear that has been metabolized slowly over days. There is the disorientation of emerged survivors who have been holding themselves in a kind of suspended reality and are now being asked to re-engage with the actual world. And there is the layered awkwardness of people who have been forced into intimacy by circumstance and are now going to have to figure out how to be strangers again, or neighbors, or whatever they were before. Mirelle moved through it practically. She stoked the stove to full burn for one final heating cycle. The walls would hold temperature for hours after she let the fire drop, and she wanted them maximally saturated before people started leaving and the door began opening and closing. She opened the larder and inventoried what remained. Enough for a modest breakfast, not enough for another day of full occupation. Which was fine. They weren't going to be here another day. She made a thin cornmeal porridge in the largest pot she had, stretching it with water and the last of the salt meat for flavor, and she fed it to people in order of need. Jesse and the baby first, then the elderly, then everyone else. It wasn't enough to satisfy anyone, but it was warm and it was food, and it was something to do with hands and mouths, while the reality of what came next assembled itself in people's minds. Orvet ate last. He came to her when most people had finished and were starting the slow process of gathering their things and preparing for the world outside. "I need to get into town," he said. "Assess the damage. Find out who else is out there. There were people I couldn't reach before it hit." "I know." She handed him the last cup of coffee, which she'd been saving. He took it without argument, which told her he understood the gesture. "Take Frank Ludlow and one of the ranch hands. Don't go alone." "I wasn't planning to." "And take the rope." She nodded at the coil still mounted on the south wall hook. "The drifts are going to be disorienting, even with good visibility." He took the rope. He organized his small team, Frank, Tyler Darnell's brother Colt, who was younger and stronger than Tyler and had barely spoken the entire time, but had worked steadily at every task Mirelle had assigned him. The three of them went out the door and into the white, and she watched them go from the doorway. Then she turned around and found Virgil Crane standing directly behind her, which startled her enough that she took a half step back. "Sorry," he said. He was holding his bandaged hand against his chest. "I wanted to talk to you before things get complicated." She waited. He looked at the floor, then up at her. "The adverse possession claim," he said. "I'm dropping my opposition to it." She hadn't expected that, and the fact that she hadn't expected it showed on her face before she could arrange it into something more neutral. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't have to." He sounded irritated, the way people sound when they're doing something that costs them something and someone is pointing out that it's optional. "I'm doing it because it's right. This land, I was holding it because I couldn't afford to resolve the tax situation, and I didn't want to admit that. I wasn't going to build anything here. I wasn't going to use it." He looked at the walls, at the stove. "You built something here, something that—" He stopped. "Something that saved my life, among others." "Your life was saved by thermal mass and clay," she said. "I just assembled it correctly." "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Giving the credit to the materials, or your grandfather, or the method." His eyes, which were not unkind when they weren't being certain, were direct. "You built this. You made every decision that mattered. The materials are the same clay and stone anyone in this valley has access to. None of us built what you built." Mirelle held very still, not because the words were unwelcome, because they landed in a place in her that had been braced for impact for so long that unexpected gentleness there was its own kind of difficulty. "Thank you," she said, for the second time she'd said it to him, in a very different register than the first. "The claim paperwork," he said. "I'll sign whatever needs signing." He paused. "And I'll speak to the county about the back taxes. Consider them my—" He searched for a word. "My contribution." He left before she could figure out what to say to that. She watched him go out the door into the white morning and stood in the doorway for a moment, not thinking about anything in particular, just existing in the specific texture of a moment that would rearrange itself into memory before long. Behind her, Perlavos said, "Close the door. You're letting the cold in." She closed the door. Getting 23 people out of the silo and into town was a logistical problem that took most of the morning, and it was not graceful. The snow depth varied dramatically depending on the drift patterns, and the route into town that had been a straightforward road 4 days ago was now a guessing game of subsurface terrain. The first group out, a small advance team of the younger and more able-bodied, led by Tyler Darnell, who seemed to have appointed himself to this role without anyone assigning it, spent 40 minutes packing down a rough path through the worst of the drifts before it was passable for the others. Mirelle helped people prepare to leave. She handed back the bedrolls she'd lent, redistributed the last of the provisions for people to carry, checked Virgil Crane's bandage one more time, and showed him how to rewrap it. She helped Jesse rig a carrying cloth from 2 scarves tied together so the baby could be held against her chest, arms free, for the walk through the snow. "How will you know if she's warm enough?" Mirelle asked. Jesse looked at her. "How do you mean?" "In a carrying position like that, the baby's face is visible. Watch for the ears. If they start going pale at the tips, she needs more insulation." She adjusted the knot. "Otherwise, trust your own body heat. You're the best heat source she has right now." Jesse looked down at the baby, then up at Mirelle. There was something in her face that was working itself out slowly. "You know a lot," she said, "about a lot of things, not just building." "My grandfather believed preparation was a form of caring," Mirelle said. "He thought most disasters were just gaps in information, and that information was something you could do something about." She tied off the last knot. "Then will you help us figure it out?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the last group, Perla's group, was moving down the packed path toward town, Perla's cane finding the firm surface with authority. Harriet Moss was walking beside her, their heads close together in conversation, which was something Mirelle wouldn't have predicted 4 days ago. "I'll come into town tomorrow," she said, "when people have had time to see what they're dealing with." Tyler nodded. He picked up his hat. At the door, he paused. "For what it's worth," he said, "I know what I said to you when you first got here, and what I did." He wasn't looking at her. "Not just the night with my brothers. The other things. Tyler, I'm not looking for you to forgive me. I'm just saying it, that I know." He put his hat on. "See you tomorrow." He left, and Mirelle stood alone in the silo for the first time in 4 days. The silence was profound. The stove ticked as it cooled slightly, contracting. The walls, warm to the touch still, radiated into the space in the deep, quiet way they had all through the storm. She walked slowly around the interior, looking at the floor where 23 people had slept and eaten and frightened each other and comforted each other, and argued about small things because they couldn't argue about the big things that were actually scaring them. There were impressions in the packed earth floor where bodies had lain. A child's mitten someone had left behind. A tin cup. 3 playing cards, which someone had apparently produced during the second day, and which had generated a quiet, low-stakes card game that had gone on for most of a day, and had involved at various points almost everyone in the silo, including Perla Voss, who had won consistently and without apparent mercy. She picked up the mitten, folded it, set it on the supply shelf to return. She sat down next to the stove. She had not cried in 7 weeks. She hadn't let herself because there was always something requiring her functional attention. Always a task that needed doing or a problem that needed thinking through. And she'd discovered during those 7 weeks that she was able to convert almost any emotion into task energy with enough practice. Grief became clay halls. Fear became roof work. Loneliness became the meticulous study of her grandfather's notebook. She'd gotten very good at the conversion. She sat by the stove in the empty, quiet, warm silo, and she did not try to convert anything. She cried for about 15 minutes. Not dramatically, nothing like that, no heaving sobs, just the straightforward hydraulics of feelings that had been queued up for a long time and were now being processed in the available order. She cried for her grandfather. She cried for the girl she'd been on a porch step in the cold with a worn satchel and $4.60. She cried for every wheelbarrow load of clay she'd pushed through a town that watched her with flat eyes. She cried for the baby she'd carried through the worst hours of the storm, and for Jessie, who didn't know where her husband was, and for Tyler Darnell's mother, who had left with nothing but a picture of a round house. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, got up, stoked the stove back to moderate burn, went to the larder and inventoried what would need restocking before anything else. She had work to do. Orvet's assessment of the town took the better part of that first day, and when he came to the silo at dusk to report it, his face carried the specific weight of a man who has been calculating losses and finding the numbers worse than expected. He sat down on the chunk of wood by the stove. She gave him hot water with dried herbs in it because the coffee was gone and the tea was gone, and hot water with herbs was still hot water. 3 structures total loss, he said. Boarding house, east bunkhouse, and what was left of the old mill. Another 6 with major structural damage, roofs compromised, walls unstable, not safe for occupation. He wrapped both hands around the cup. That's 9 structures, about 40 people who don't have safe homes right now. He paused. Winter isn't over. We're in a break, but there will be more. Nothing like this. I don't think there's anything like this twice in a lifetime. But regular hard weather? Yes, for another 3 months at least. Mirelle was already thinking through it in the background, the numbers and the logistics and what was possible, while she also stayed present with him in the conversation. Who's organizing the response? She asked. That's partly why I'm here. He looked at her steadily. The town council met this afternoon, first meeting we could manage. 4 people, 2 of them sheltering with neighbors because they don't have structures right now. We talked about rebuilding. He paused. Your name came up. I assumed it would. There are people who want to do what you did. Round structures, earthen walls, the thermal mass design. He set down the cup. There are also people who want to rebuild exactly what they had before. Same materials, same methods, because that's what they know. That's a reasonable position, she said. He looked at her. Is it? It's what they're comfortable with. Comfort isn't nothing. She thought about it. But it's also how you end up in the same position in 50 years. Would you be willing to advise? Not design everything. I know that's not realistic, but advise. Show people what's transferable from what you know, what they can implement without having to rebuild everything from scratch. She looked at the walls, at the stove, at the space around her that had been, 8 weeks ago, a condemned steel shell with a faded pink condemned painted on the side, and nothing inside but broken dreams and concrete. There are conditions, she said. He waited. The adverse possession claim goes through. Virgil Crane's already agreed to drop his opposition, but I need the county to process it without obstruction. She ticked on her finger. Anyone who wants advice gets it free of charge, but the work itself, the actual labor, if I'm involved in construction, I get paid. Not in favors, in money or in clear value exchange. Fair. And she stopped. This one was harder to say, not because she didn't mean it, but because it required her to admit something about what the last 2 months had cost her. I'm not doing it to make this town like me. I'm doing it because the work is worth doing. If people want to make something of me because of it, that's their choice. But I need that to be understood going in. Orvet was quiet for a moment. I understand that. I need the council to understand it. I'll tell them. He picked up the cup again and held it without drinking. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. When you came here, you ran from a bad situation, from what I can piece together. You arrived with nothing. You built this. He gestured at the walls. You could have built it somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't openly hostile to you. Why here? Mirelle thought about it honestly, because he'd asked it honestly. I didn't choose Iron Hollow specifically, she said. I chose the silo. The silo happened to be here. She paused. But once I was here, I don't know. There was something about being told you can't do something that makes you want to do it in the most visible place possible. He almost smiled. Your grandfather's temperament. Probably. She stood up because sitting still was becoming difficult and her body wanted to be useful. I'll come to town tomorrow. We can look at the damaged structures together, and I can tell you what I think is salvageable and what needs to start over. He stood too. Thank you, Mirelle. She noticed it. Her name, not Miss, not the careful official distance he'd maintained since the first conversation at the fence. The small geography of that shift. Get some sleep, she said. You look terrible. 4 days on a packed earth floor will do that. He went to the door. For what it's worth, what you did here, keeping 23 people alive and warm and fed and mostly sane for 4 days. That's not a small thing. I know, she said. And then, because honesty seemed to be the mode they were operating in, I was scared for most of it. I know, he said back. I could tell. You just didn't let it run you. He left. She listened to his boots on the snow outside, the sounds growing smaller, and then she was alone again in the warm dark of the silo, which was hers, which was completely and legally hers now, which she had built from nothing in 8 weeks with cracked hands and $4.60 and a dead man's notebook. She slept better than she had in months. She came into town the next morning as she'd said she would, and what she found was difficult to look at and also clarifying in the way that difficult things sometimes are. The boarding house roof had come down in 2 sections, and the interior was exposed to the sky and filled with snow. The personal belongings of 8 lodgers were buried somewhere under that snow. Clothes, documents, the small objects that carry a life's particulars. People were already digging, carefully, because there was a woman named Ruth who had gone back for her husband's war photograph when the storm was just beginning and hadn't made it to the silo. And Orvet wasn't saying anything definitive about Ruth yet, but his face. When her name came up was doing something that Mirelle understood without being told. She went to the east bunkhouse. The north wall had failed at the foundation, exactly the weak point she'd seen in the roofline 6 weeks ago. The sag that indicated a compromised ridge beam, which had transmitted its weakness down through the structure until the weight of snow plus wind pressure had found the softest place and pushed through it. The remaining 3 walls stood at angles that would need to come down before they came down on their own terms. She walked the entire main road of Iron Hollow with Orvet and Frank Ludlow and Harriet Moss, who had inserted herself into the assessment process with the authority of a woman who has served on every town committee for 20 years and was not about to stop now. Harriet had said almost nothing to her since the apology in the silo, but she was present and focused, and she asked good questions, which was its own kind of communication. At the end of the survey, Mirelle had a picture in her head of Iron Hollow's structural reality, and she organized it into categories the way her grandfather had taught her to organize any large problem. What was stable, what was compromised but repairable, what needed to come down, and what needed to be reconsidered from the ground up. 6 structures need to come down, she said, when they were standing in front of the sheriff's office, which was one of the sturdier buildings on Main Street and had sustained only cosmetic damage. Completely, starting over. The rest can be repaired, but several of them need structural intervention before they're safe for occupation. The 6 that need to come down, Frank said. What goes up instead? She looked at him. What do you want? He hadn't expected the question to come back at him. What do you mean, what do I want? I mean, the rebuilding is your choice. I can tell you what performs best in this climate with these materials. I can tell you what my grandfather knew and what August Holt knew and what I learned building the silo, but it's your town. She paused. What do you want it to be able to survive? A silence. The 4 of them standing in the snow in the stripped clean blue light of the post-storm morning, with the evidence of what inadequate preparation looked like visible in every damaged roofline around them. Frank Ludlow said, What you built. Can it be done bigger? Not exactly what I built. The full circular design is optimal for a standalone shelter, but for working structures, for a feed store or a boarding house or a family home, you adapt the principles. The earthen insulation can be integrated into a more conventional footprint. The thermal mass stove system works in any size space. The key structural improvements are the wall thickness, the materials, and the roof design. Show us, Harriet said. Not asked, stated, the way Harriet Moss did most things. Mirelle looked at her. Show you what specifically? Whatever you need to show us so we understand what we're committing to. Harriet's hands were folded in front of her in her characteristic posture, but her eyes were serious and direct. We're asking you to help us rebuild this town. We should understand what that means before we start. Mirelle thought about the 7-year-old boy who had slept through most of the storm on his father's leg, about Jesse and the baby and the carrying cloth, about Dobie playing his harmonica in the dark while the storm made the earth shake. Come to the silo this afternoon, she said. I'll show you my grandfather's notebook. I'll explain the principles. And then we can talk about what's realistic for Iron Hollow. They came. Not just the 4 of them. Word had traveled in the way that word travels in small towns, which is instantly and with embellishments. By mid-afternoon, there were 14 people at the silo. Mirelle had not planned for 14, but she opened the door and let them in and did what she'd always done when the situation demanded more than she'd prepared for. She adapted. She stood at the stove with her grandfather's notebook open to the cross-section diagram, the one she'd read 50 times, the one that had been her companion through 7 weeks of building and 4 days of survival. And she explained it, not simply and not with condescension, but the way Ezra Ashcombe had always explained things to her, as if the information was important enough to treat the listener as capable of understanding it. She explained thermal mass and why round structures handled wind differently from square ones. She explained clay straw composites and where the material came from and what it cost in labor versus what it saved in fuel over a winter. She explained stove positioning and convection and why the flue angle mattered. She explained what had failed in the damaged structures and what would have prevented those failures. People asked questions. Real ones. Not the rhetorical questions of people who have already decided what they think, but the genuine inquiries of people who are trying to understand something new because they have recently been shown, comprehensively, that what they already know is not enough. Virgil Crane, sitting against the east wall with his bandaged hand in his lap, asked about the cost comparison. Conventional rebuild versus the thermal mass approach. Higher material cost up front, Mirelle said. The clay and straw are locally available, but the labor is significant, skilled labor. You need someone who knows what they're doing at each stage. Can it be learned? He asked. That's the point, she said. My grandfather believed the only reason these methods had been forgotten was that nobody had bothered to teach them. He spent 30 years documenting them so they could be taught. She held up the notebook. Everything I know is in here, and I can teach what's in here. A quiet settled over the room. Not the suspended quiet of the storm, but a different kind. The quality of quiet that comes when a group of people are simultaneously arriving at the same idea from different directions. Greta, from behind the dry goods store counter, practical, businesslike Greta, who had always been fair to Mirelle without making anything of it, spoke up from near the door. How long to train someone? She asked. To do the earthen wall work themselves? Depends on the person. The basic technique, enough to work under guidance, is a week. To work independently and make the judgment calls, a season. A season, Greta said, as if she was pricing it. It's not a fast skill, Mirelle said, but it doesn't expire and it doesn't depend on supply chains or what Callaway has in stock. She looked around the room. The clay is in the creek bed half a mile east. The straw comes from any farm in this valley. The stone is in the hills. The only thing you need that you can't find locally is the knowledge. And you have the knowledge, Virgil said. I have my grandfather's knowledge, plus what I added to it. She paused. And I'm willing to pass it on. The room did the thing rooms do when a decision is being made collectively without anyone formally announcing it. A series of small personal acknowledgments, nods, exhaled breaths, glances exchanged between people who know each other well enough to read each other's decisions without words. Orvet spoke from the back. I think we're all hearing the same thing. Nobody argued with that. It was 2 days later that the moment happened that Mirelle had not planned for and could not have planned for. She was at the damaged east bunkhouse, doing a structural assessment of the remaining walls before they came down, when she heard boots behind her and turned to find Tyler Darnell standing in the snow. He had one of his ranch hands with him, a young man she didn't know, and both of them were carrying tools. We're here to help, Tyler said. Not offering, stating. She looked at him. At the hand tools. Shovels, a pry bar, a level. Things she needed. I need the south wall cleared of snow before I can assess the footing, she said. Start at the base and work upward. Don't disturb the wall itself, just the accumulation against it. They started working without another word. She went back to her assessment. They worked like that for an hour, the three of them, mostly silent except for the occasional practical exchange. Move left. Watch that corner. Is this footing here or further back? The functional conversation of people doing a job together. At some point during that hour, without either of them marking it or commenting on it, whatever had been unresolved between them became something else. Not resolved, exactly. That word was too clean. More like set aside in a place where it could exist without demanding immediate attention. People who have been through the same 4 days together carry a shared reference that changes the grammar of their relationship, and what Tyler Darnell had been to her before the storm and what he was now were not the same thing, and they both understood that without needing to say it. Colt Darnell showed up an hour after Tyler, then Frank Ludlow. Then 3 more people she recognized from the silo. By mid-afternoon, there were 11 people at the East Bunkhouse site, doing work she'd organized without meaning to organize. And what was happening was not quite a crew and not quite a community, but was in the early stages of becoming something with characteristics of both. She stood in the middle of it with her grandfather's notebook in her coat pocket and a pencil behind her ear and clay on her hands, and she thought about August Holt walking away with his enormous pack and 3 words on a piece of paper, and she thought about Perla Voss and a cartload of straw and the specific kind of recognition that old people give you when they see something in you that they've been waiting a long time to see. She thought about a boot in her back and a door closing and a lock turning, and how that moment, which had felt like the end of something, had turned out to be the first moment of something else entirely. Orvet came at dusk, when the light was going amber and cold. "Town council wants to make something formal," he said. "An official agreement. You advise the rebuilding, you get paid. Actual money, not favors. We're going to set up a proper arrangement. And in exchange, the county expedites the adverse possession claim, and Virgil backs the back taxes. I told you I'd help regardless of the formal arrangement." "I know you did. That's part of why the council wants to formalize it." He looked at the site around them, at the people still working as the light dropped. "It's also—" He paused, choosing words with some care. "This town owes you a debt. A formal arrangement is one way of acknowledging that. Not fully. I don't think there's a full accounting for what happened, but it's something that looks like the town taking responsibility." She thought about what she'd said to him 2 days ago, that she wasn't doing this to make the town like her. She still meant that. But she also understood the difference between needing acceptance and accepting it when it was honestly offered. "All right," she said, "I'll come to the council meeting." He nodded. He started to leave. She stopped him. "Orvet." He turned. "Ruth," she said, "have you—" His face did the thing she'd seen it do when Ruth's name came up, and now she understood it better, because it was the expression of someone who has found what they were afraid they'd find. "She was in her room," he said. "She'd sheltered in place, under 2 mattresses, apparently. Older woman, strong instincts." He paused. "She's at the Voss house now. She'll be all right." Mirelle exhaled something she'd been holding for 3 days. "Good," she said. "That's good." He left. She stood at the edge of the work site in the deepening cold and watched the last of the daylight leave the sky over Iron Hollow, the blue going to gray, going to the deep purple black of a clear winter night, with stars beginning to come out over the mountains. The mountains that had held the storm for 7 weeks and then sent it down the valley like a reckoning. She wasn't angry at Iron Hollow anymore. She wasn't sure when that had happened. Somewhere in the 4 days, she thought, in the small hours when the storm was at its loudest, and she was moving through the dark interior, checking on people, and the things they'd said about her, and the things they'd done seemed very small against the fact of 23 breathing human beings who were warm because she'd built the right walls. She wasn't not angry at what had been done to her. That was a distinction worth making. The boot in her back was still a boot in her back. The mockery was still the mockery. The flat, indifferent eyes were still what they'd been. But anger at those things, and the ability to do the work that needed doing in front of her, she'd learned to hold both. The way a good wall holds the heat on one side and the cold on the other, the two coexisting without either destroying the boundary between them. She pulled her coat tighter and turned back toward the silo. The stove needed tending. It always needed tending. Behind her, the town of Iron Hollow sat in its snow and its damage and its beginning, the evening light going out of it the way light goes out of everything, making room for whatever came next. The council meeting was held in the sheriff's office because it was one of the few structures with a sound roof and enough floor space for the people who needed to be in the room. Mirelle arrived 5 minutes early. Not because she was nervous, she'd moved past nervous somewhere around the second clay hall, when she'd understood that the only opinions about her work that actually mattered were the opinions of physics and weather, but because arriving early was a habit her grandfather had installed in her, the belief that punctuality was a form of respect that cost nothing and communicated everything. There were 7 people at the table: Orvet, Harriet Moss, Frank Ludlow, Virgil Crane, Greta from the dry goods store, a rancher named Patterson, who hadn't been in the silo during the storm, but whose property bordered the silo land to the south, and a man named Ellis, who ran the assay office and sat on every official committee in Iron Hollow, apparently by virtue of having nowhere else to be. Mirelle sat in the chair they'd left for her and put her grandfather's notebook on the table in front of her and did not say anything while they arranged themselves. Orvet opened it. "You know why we're here?" "I do." "Then I'll skip the preamble." He had a document in front of him, a single page, handwritten, with the county header at the top. The terms are as follows. The county will expedite the adverse possession claim on the silo property. Virgil Crane has agreed in writing to withdraw his opposition and to settle the outstanding tax liability on the parcel, which transfers clean title to you upon processing. He paused. In exchange, you agree to serve as a building consultant to the reconstruction effort for a period of 1 year at a rate of, he looked at a number he'd written, $12 a month plus materials sourced from county funds for any demonstration projects. $12 a month was not a large sum. It was also $12 more a month than she'd had when she arrived in Iron Hollow, and it was honest money for honest work, which in her experience was rarer than people like to believe. "I have one addition," she said. Orvet waited. "I want to run a formal training program, not just advise on individual builds, teach the method, earthen wall construction, thermal mass stove building, structural assessment. Anyone in Iron Hollow who wants to learn it, I'll teach them." She paused. "The knowledge dies with me if I'm the only one who has it. My grandfather made that mistake. He documented everything, but he didn't teach enough people while he was alive. I don't intend to repeat it." A silence. Ellis from the assay office looked like he was trying to find an objection and couldn't locate one. Harriet Moss said, "Who would attend?" "Anyone who wants to, ranch hands, farmers, women who build and maintain their own homes." She met Harriet's eyes. "Everyone who might need to build or repair a structure in this valley." Harriet nodded, once, the way she nodded when a thing had been decided. "Add it to the agreement," Orvet said. Nobody objected. The document was amended, initialed by everyone present. Virgil Crane signed his separate withdrawal with his uninjured left hand, slowly, and when he pushed it across the table to Mirelle, he met her eyes and said nothing, which was its own kind of thing. She signed her name at the bottom of the agreement, Mirelle Ashcombe. The handwriting was her grandfather's handwriting almost exactly. She'd noticed it years ago, the way his letter forms had transferred to her through hours of sitting beside him, watching him write. She thought he would have had something to say about that, something stubborn and brilliant, and not quite an apology for anything. She put the pen down, and the meeting was over, and the silo was hers. The rebuilding began in earnest when the snow settled enough to work in, which was 3 weeks after the storm, and it was harder and messier and slower than anyone had anticipated, because real work always is. Mirelle had warned them. She'd stood in front of 14 people in the silo and explained the process honestly, including the parts that weren't exciting. The weeks of clay hauling before a single wall section was finished, the trial and error of stove construction, the way earthen walls required a dry-out period before they reached their full structural strength, and what that meant for the building timeline. She told them it would take longer and cost more labor than conventional wood frame construction, and that the payoff was a structure that could outlast their grandchildren if it was built right. Some people had heard that and decided conventional was fine. She didn't argue with them. She helped them reinforce what they were rebuilding: better roof connections, improved drainage, structural improvements that didn't require a full philosophical shift. And she saved the deeper teaching for the people who had asked for it. The first class met on a Wednesday morning at the creek bend where the clay deposit was. 9 people showed up. Tyler Darnell, which she'd expected. Colt Darnell, which she hadn't. Greta from the dry goods store, in work clothes that suggested she'd built things before. 2 of the ranch hands from the silo, including Dobie with his harmonica tucked into his coat pocket apparently at all times. A farm woman named Bee from the South Valley who had driven 2 hours to be there. Frank Ludlow. A 15-year-old girl named Sadie, whose parents ran the general store and who had apparently decided, on her own authority, that she was going to learn this. And Ruth, the woman who had sheltered under 2 mattresses during the storm, who had lost most of her possessions when the boarding house roof came down, and who showed up with a determined expression and a pair of work gloves that had seen real use. Mirelle looked at them in the cold morning light, their breath visible, standing at the edge of the clay bank with varying degrees of certainty on their faces. And she thought about a man who had spent 30 years trying to teach the world something the world wasn't ready to hear yet. She opened the notebook to the first relevant page. This is where it starts, she said. Not with walls, not with design, with material. You have to understand what you're building with before you build with it, because clay is not all the same, straw is not all the same, and stone is not all the same, and if you treat them like they are, they'll tell you the difference in the worst possible moment. She crouched at the bank and dug into the clay with her bare hand. Feel this. She passed it to Tyler first, who was nearest. He squeezed it, felt it, passed it to Colt. It went around the group. Dense, said Greta, holds its shape. That's what you want. That density is what gives you thermal mass. Loose clay, sandy clay, clay with too much silt. It compresses wrong, it cracks on drying, and your wall develops weak points. She stood. We're going to spend this morning learning to read the deposit. You're going to dig from 6 different spots along this bank, and you're going to tell me what's different about each one. Sadie, the 15-year-old, was already picking up a stick to dig with. Mirelle handed her the proper tool, a narrow spade, and watched her face change when she felt the difference it made. That was the thing about teaching, Mirelle was discovering. It looked like talking and demonstrating, but what it actually was, at its core, was the management of small moments of understanding. The instant when a face changed because a hand had felt something the mind hadn't expected. Her grandfather had been doing that for 30 years. She was 18 years old, and she had 9 people on a creek bank in the cold, and every time one of their faces changed, she felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Adjacent to pride, adjacent to continuity, something that moved in a direction beyond herself. Spring came the way spring comes in a hard winter valley, late and argumentative, with false starts and setbacks. Warm days that gave way to freezing nights that gave way to mud so deep it swallowed boot heels. Construction was stop and start. Earthen walls needed dry conditions to cure properly, and Iron Hollow that spring was not reliably offering dry conditions. But they built. The first new structure to go up was the boarding house replacement, not round. The footprint didn't accommodate a full circular design, and the practical needs of 8 lodgers required a layout that a pure silo-type structure couldn't efficiently serve. What it was instead was something new, a rectangular footprint with earthen insulation integrated into the walls, a thermal mass stove system based on her grandfather's design, a roof with a steeper pitch than the original and better load distribution, and a structural approach that treated the building not as a collection of separate elements, but as a single interconnected system where each part supported the others. Harriet Moss had been instrumental in the boarding house project in a way that surprised Mirelle and then stopped surprising her. Harriet was a woman who organized things. It was in her nature the way building was in Mirelle's nature. And once she'd decided the earthen construction method was worth organizing around, she'd brought to it the full force of the same energy that ran the Ladies' Charitable Society and 6 other civic committees. She'd coordinated the material supply chain, managed the volunteer labor schedule, handled the interactions with the county assessor's office over the building permits. She'd also shown up 3 times a week to work alongside the actual builders, in the same work clothes she'd apparently always owned but never had public occasion to wear, learning the wall technique with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. She wasn't graceful at it. Her first wall section had to be partially redone because she'd packed the clay too wet, a mistake that most people made once and then understood with their hands why you didn't repeat it. She'd accepted the correction with clenched jaw and redone the section herself. Mirelle had watched this and thought, "We are not so different, Harriet Moss and I. We both do the work to prove something we already know, and the only difference is what we were trying to prove it to." She'd never said this to Harriet. Some understandings are more useful as private property. It was midsummer when August Holt came back through. She saw him from the roof of the new boarding house, where she was doing a final inspection of the ridge beam connection. He came on foot, the same enormous pack, the same deliberate pace of a man who has been walking long distances his entire life, and has made a separate peace with it. He stopped at the main road of Iron Hollow and looked at what had changed, and she could see from 50 yards away the quality of his looking, the professional assessment, the same one she'd done on the silo when she first arrived. She came down the ladder and walked to meet him. He took in the boarding house, the 2 other new structures visible from the main road, both built on modified versions of the thermal mass principle. The clay work visible in the exposed wall section where a door frame was still being fitted. "You've been busy," he said. You left in a hurry, she said. I had somewhere to be. He looked at the boarding house roof, the pitch, the connection points. Who designed the ridge configuration? I did, based on your sketch, the one you left under the lamp. He looked at it for another moment. It's right, he said. Better than the sketch, actually. You added the secondary brace at the third rafter. The primary connection point had too much point load stress without it. He turned and looked at her in the way he'd looked at her work the first time. That same evaluating attention, but now it was directed at her rather than at the wall. Your grandfather would be insufferable about you, he said, in the best possible way. Perla Voss had said the same thing. She'd said it first, and Mirelle had filed it away in the place where she kept things that were too large to look at directly. Do you want to see the training program? She asked. He did. She took him to the creek bend where the current class was working. 12 people now, the second cohort, because the first cohort had finished their foundational training, and 3 of them were already working on builds under her supervision. He watched the class work for a long time, standing back, arms crossed, the field notebook she recognized as his own open in his hand. Sadie, the 15-year-old, was demonstrating the clay moisture test to a pair of newcomers. She did it with the ease of someone for whom the physical knowledge had settled into muscle memory. The roll, the squeeze, the specific way you read the crack pattern when you compress the sample between your palms. Holt watched her. How long has she been studying? 4 months. She's good. She's very good. Mirelle paused. She's also going to be better than me inside of 2 years. She has instincts I had to work for. He made the sound she'd come to understand was his version of approval. He wrote something in his field notebook. She didn't ask what. He stayed 2 days this time. He ran an impromptu session on high country construction adaptations, cold climate variations on the thermal mass principle, techniques he'd developed over 4 decades in the mountains. And he taught it to whoever showed up, which turned out to be the entire first cohort plus 6 people who hadn't signed up for anything but heard there was someone from the high country and came anyway. When he left, he gave her 3 pages of handwritten notes to add to Ezra Ashcombe's notebook. She tucked them in at the back and they sat there with the sketch he'd left the first time, his handwriting and her grandfather's handwriting in the same book, like a correspondence that had taken a long time and a roundabout route, but had finally arrived where it was supposed to. By the time the leaves turned in Iron Hollow that fall, 9 of the 12 structures that had been damaged or destroyed in the storm had been rebuilt. 6 of them incorporated earthen insulation, 4 used the full thermal mass stove system, and 2, the boarding house and the east bunkhouse replacement, were teaching models, buildings that Mirelle used for the training program because their construction had been documented at every stage and could be opened up and explained. The silo stood at the east edge of town exactly as it had always stood, and Mirelle lived in it exactly as she'd always lived in it, and it was hers now in every legal and physical sense, the adverse possession claim having been processed, and the title recorded in her name at the county clerk's office. She'd gone to pick up the document on a Tuesday morning and carried it back to the silo and set it on the shelf above the stove next to her grandfather's notebook, and stood looking at both of them for a while. She wasn't the same person who'd arrived with a worn satchel and $4.60. She also wasn't a different person in the way that stories sometimes suggest, as if hardship is a chrysalis and you emerge from it as something better and cleaner than you went in. What she was the same person with more information, more experience, more hard-won understanding of what she was capable of, and what people were capable of, and what structures were capable of, and what those 3 things had in common. They were all more resilient than they looked, and they all required the right conditions to show it. There were things she hadn't resolved. The mother she'd lost young and the stepmother who'd kicked her out of her own doorway, and the specific taxonomy of grief and anger, those 2 things had left behind. She was 18 years old going on 19, and she understood that those were problems for a longer timeline than a winter in Iron Hollow. She'd carry them the way you carry weight in a well-fitted pack, not lightly, but in a way that didn't prevent forward movement. She thought about Margaret sometimes. Not often. When she did, what she felt was less anger than a kind of bewilderment, the confusion of someone trying to understand a choice they themselves would never make. She couldn't make it make sense, and eventually she'd stop trying to, because some people's choices don't explain themselves, and demanding that they do is just another way of letting them occupy space in you that they haven't earned. Orvet had suggested once, carefully, that if she ever wanted to go back to address what had happened, legally or otherwise, the county had resources. "I know," she said. "The offer stands." "I know that too." She'd looked at the walls of the silo, at the stove, at the neat row of her grandfather's notebook, plus August Holt's pages, plus the 7 pages of her own additions to the back. "I'm not sure going back is the right word for it. I don't think that place is behind me. I think it's just somewhere I don't need to be." He'd accepted that. He was good at accepting things without requiring them to be different. On the first cold morning of the second autumn, the anniversary, roughly, of her arrival in Iron Hollow, Mirelle unlocked the silo and went through it with the same systematic eye she brought to every structure, checked the roof seals, felt the walls for any new cracking, confirmed the stove damper was moving freely, checked the larder stock, which she kept maintained out of habit now, the preparation discipline so deep in her at this point that it happened without conscious effort. Everything was sound, of course it was. She'd built it to be sound. She stood at the center of the circular space in the early light and looked at what she'd made. The earthen walls had taken on a patina over the year, darker at the base where the temperature differential condensed moisture slightly, lighter near the ceiling where the heat rose and dried. The stove had the matte gray of long use. The sleeping platform had a worn path beside it from 12 months of feet, finding the same route each morning. It looked like a place that had been lived in, which was exactly what it was. Outside, Iron Hollow was waking up. She could hear the particular sounds of a small town in early morning. The feed store opening, a wagon on the road, someone calling a name across the gap between houses. The sounds of a place that had been damaged and rebuilt and was now, simply, continuing. Sadie would arrive at the creek bend at 7 for the third cohort's first session. Ruth had signed up for this one, wanting to go beyond the basic training into the stove construction work. Dobie had asked last week if the thermal mass principles applied to the stone structures he'd seen in the hill country where he grew up, and she'd said yes and sketched him a comparison and watched his face do the thing faces did when something clicked, and she'd thought, there it is, that's why you teach. She picked up her grandfather's notebook. Not to read it, she knew it by heart now, every diagram, every margin note, every water-stained page. She picked it up because she wanted to hold it, the way you hold something when you want to feel the weight of what it cost and what it gave you, because those two things are often the same thing. Ezra Ashcombe had built things alone in places nobody was watching. He'd documented everything and trusted that eventually it would matter. He'd handed that trust to a 6-year-old girl with good eyes for structure and left her to figure out the rest. She figured it out. Not cleanly, not without injury or failure, or nights where the cold was too close and the work was too much, and the loneliness was a physical thing pressing on her chest. Not without cracking in private while staying solid in public, which was its own kind of exhausting and which nobody would ever see and which didn't need to be seen. Not without making mistakes in the construction and mistakes with people and mistakes in the long catalog of ways an 18-year-old alone in the world has not yet learned every lesson that the world has prepared. But she figured it out. And the figuring out was in the walls, visible to anyone who knew how to look. In the thickness and the curve and the thermal mass that held warmth through the worst night. In the stove that drew clean. In the berm that turned the killing wind away from the door. She'd been told she was nothing, and she'd built something that proved otherwise, and the proof was 2 feet thick and made of the earth under everyone's feet, which had been there all along, waiting for someone to remember what it was for. She set the notebook back on its shelf, pulled on her coat, picked up her tools. Outside, the morning was cold and blue and open in every direction, the mountains visible to the north for the first time in weeks, their peaks white against the sky. The same mountains that had held the storm. The same valley floor that had taken the damage. The same creek half a mile east with the same clay bank where 9 people had stood on a cold morning and felt something new in their hands for the first time. Mirelle Ashcombe walked out of her home and into Iron Hollow, and Iron Hollow let her come. That was not nothing. That was not a small thing. It was in fact the whole point, not the triumph of being accepted, which is a story about other people's opinions, but the arrival at a place where you belong because you built the belonging yourself, out of the materials available, according to the old methods that work, with the kind of patience that doesn't perform itself for anyone. She walked east toward the creek. Behind her, the silo stood in the morning light, round and solid and unchanged, holding its warmth the way it always had, quietly, completely, and without asking anyone's permission.